everyone who has joined us this fine, if rather cloudy Monday morning. And our talk today is going to be about women in archaeology. And I have to begin by saying that there are many women in archaeology. What I wanted to do today was to focus on a few selected biographies with a couple of criteria in mind. One, I have chosen women in archaeology who have a link to the British Museum. This may come as no surprise to you. So they have either been involved with adding objects to the British Museum collection, or have at some point been involved in working with the British Museum and in specifically with particular departments and groups of curators in the museum. The other thing I wanted to do was to look at two different aspects of the narratives around women in archaeology that we, as people reading and seeing history, are given, and perhaps to challenge those a little bit. So for the first part of the talk, I'm going to be looking at some women archaeologists who worked primarily during the 1800s through into the beginning of the 1900s. And I'm going to be looking at how the stories of women who worked in archaeology during this period are often obscured because of the way that society was constructed at that time. So when we go back to the 1800s, we have a period where we don't have women at universities. So in terms of the professionalisation of women within archaeology, that was not a route they could take. We also have a period where publications often came out in the name of one person. And we'll see, for example, when we're talking about Hilda Petrie, that a lot of her work, a lot of the recording, a lot of the editing work, a lot of the information gathering that she did on excavations then became subsumed into the published works by her husband, Flinders Petrie. And then in the second part of the talk, I'd like to take one very specific example, which is the recent Netflix film, The Dig, produced in 2001. And what I want to do here is have a look at how stories of women in archaeology are presented to us. And again, just to challenge those a little bit and see how we often have to be careful about how historical figures are presented to us. We're all very aware of the role of narrative, the role of dramatic incidents, the role of artistic license in any narrative written or filmed presentation is. But I'd just like to use The Dig as a case study to start unpicking some of the ways that the women involved in that particular dig have been obscured and in one case actually written out of the narrative. So I'm going to begin by pulling up my PowerPoint. So we'll just get that up on the screen. We'll just get our slideshow started from the beginning. Always a good place to start, I believe. And we will begin our talk today with my trusty red laser pointer on Trowel Blazers, women in archaeology. And we're going to begin with a lady called Mabel Bent. And on the far left of the screen, you can see a small Cycladic jar. And this jar is part of the British Museum collection, and it was donated by Mabel to the British Museum and is part of the Cycladic ancient Greek collections in the Department of Greece and Rome. Now, Mabel herself, who we can see twice on the other side of the screen, was born in 1847 and grew up in County Wexford, Ireland. In 1877, she married James Theodore Bent, hence the name by which we know her, Mabel Bent. Her husband rarely used his first name, James, and he's usually known as Theodore Bent. He was an anthropologist who studied folklore and lifestyles and undertook archaeological excavation as part of his research. Mabel accompanied her husband on his travels, took part in excavations, collecting objects, and was often the travel photographer. And this is how we see her in the photo on the far right. She was an experienced photographer and took photos of the different journeys and excavations that she and her husband were involved in. And some of these photos were later published in a book that she wrote toward the end of her life. Mabel and Theodore lived at 43 Great Cumberland Place near Marble Arch in London, later moving closer to Marble Arch when they moved to number 13. And Mabel remained in this rented townhouse until after her husband's death in 1897 and continued to live there until her own death in 1929. In 1883, the Bents travelled to the Cycladic Islands in the Aegean Sea, east of mainland Greece. Now, little was known about the islands at the time. There were only scant references by the classical authors and some descriptions by earlier travellers. The early farming inhabitants of the island had buried their dead in small chambers cut into the island rocks. And Theodore opened 40 of these graves in 2 cemeteries on one of the islands. Mabel was with him, and this small pottery jug was given by her to the British Museum in 1926. Now, the jug comes from one of the Cycladic Islands and dates to about 1500 BC. And it was recovered at a time when only occasional stray finds from the islands were known. And it's assumed by the museum that the jug was a personal possession, which Mabel later gave to the BM. Now, excavations have since revealed a large settlement on the south side of the islands, heavily influenced by Minoan Crete. In contrast, this jug that we have at the British Museum is purely in the Cycladic Island style. It's got painted eyes on each side, and we can see one here in the image on screen, and then a small row of dots around the neck. So in archaeological terms, we're looking at a piece of pottery which could be referred to as native or insular ware, which has not been influenced by the material culture and the ideas which later came into the Cycladic Islands from mainland, from Minoan Crete. Mabel Bent, between 1877 and 1897, spent 20 years travelling, collecting and researching in some remote areas of the Eastern Mediterranean, Africa and the Middle East. In 1891, she was in modern Zimbabwe, exploring the site of the ancient city of Great Zimbabwe. And these leather and brass bracelets, which you can see on the left side of the screen, made by the Shona people of Zimbabwe, belonged to Mabel Bent and are now part of the British Museum collection. Now, the museum estimates that these bracelets were made after 1850. So for us, they're historical items. For Mabel, they were probably items that had either been made very recently or a short time ago and had perhaps passed down through a couple of hands before Mabel collected them, brought them back to Britain and eventually donated them to the museum. In 1893, Mabel and Theodore visited the city of Ascom in Africa, where they described ancient monuments in the area, copied inscriptions, collected tools, weapons and paintings, and also manuscripts, which were then given to the British Museum. So this was an enterprise, a research enterprise that Theodore had been commissioned by the museum to undertake in Africa. Unfortunately, in 1897 in South Arabia, Theodore was seized by malaria. He was rushed home to London but died there that May. And Mabel published an account of their final travels, including photographs she had taken, in 1900. In the same year as the Cycladic jar entered the collection, 1926, Mabel donated a small collection of South Arabian items, including this fragment of a limestone stele. Now, the inscription on the stele refers to the ancient kingdom of Sabah, which controlled large areas of ancient Yemen about 1000 BC. And again, this item came into the British Museum directly from Mabel, rather than through the collections which her husband had formerly donated from the work in Africa. So it would appear that again, this item was probably part of Mabel's own personal collection, which in 1926, after the death of her husband and shortly before her own death, she donated to the British Museum to be part of a public collection. The next woman in archaeology we are going to meet is a lady called Amelia Edwards. And Amelia Edwards, who we can see earlier in her life on the left, was born in 1831 and lived with her family at 19 Wharton Street, Clerkenwell, Islington. She was educated at home and she published her first poem, aged 7, in a weekly magazine. And she actually went on to write poetry, stories and articles for a number of magazines, including Charles Dickens' household works. And she also wrote novels. In the 1870s, she began travelling abroad and writing accounts of these travels. And over the winter of 1873-4, she went to Egypt, as she said, to escape the winter rains in Italy. And here she took part in an excavation at the temple of Ramesses II at Abnel Simnel. And from then on, Egyptology became the focus of her work. And her book, which we see in the centre of the screen, 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, based on her trip, came out in 1877 and was an immediate bestseller. On returning home, Amelia was determined to promote Egyptian archaeology, but also highlight the damage she had seen at many ancient monuments, including a temple chapel at Abnel Simnel. And I'm going to read you a short extract that she wrote about the damage she had seen in the temple, just to give you an insight into what she saw when she was in Egypt and the concern she wanted to raise back in Britain around the way in which Egyptian antiquities, and in particular sites such as tombs and chapels, were being treated at the time. She begins, "I am told that the wall paintings, which we had the happiness of admiring in all their beauty and freshness, were already much injured. Such is the fate of every Egyptian monument, great or small. The tourist carves it over with names and dates, and in some instances with caricatures. The student of Egyptology, by taking wet paper squeezes, sponges away every vestige of the original colour. The collector buys and carries off everything of value that he can. The work of destruction, meanwhile, goes on apace. There is no one to prevent it, there is no one to discourage it. Every day, more inscriptions are mutilated, more tombs are rifled, more paintings and sculptures are defaced." In response, in collaboration with Reginald Poole, who was keeper of coins and medals at the British Museum, Amelia began planning an Egyptological society which met for the first time in June 1880 at the British Museum. In 1882, it formally became known as the Egypt Exploration Fund, with Amelia and Reginald Poole as its joint honorary secretaries. Reginald ran the internal administration and Amelia managed the publicity and the subscription work. And as part of her fundraising efforts, she undertook lecture tours of Britain and America. The society they had set up was soon able to finance the work of archaeologist Hilda Petrie. But Amelia's involvement in fund matters decreased as decisions were increasingly made by a British Museum-based subcommittee in which she was not included. Now, this marginalisation was partly due to the fact that she spent time away from London fundraising and was possibly compounded by her close friendship with archaeologist Hilda Petrie, who openly disagreed with the decisions of the British Museum subcommittee, at one point declaring, "I would rather forswear Egypt altogether and go into chemistry than have anything to do with Mr. Newton," one of the committee members and a British Museum curator. After 1880, Amelia gave up her successful career as a novelist to write exclusively on Egyptian history and to translate foreign language works on Egypt. She also contributed papers to conferences and wrote articles for newspapers such as the Illustrated London News and the Times, reporting on excavations directly supported by the Egyptian Exploration Fund. Her work played a key role in shifting emphasis within within Egyptology, because until that point, the study of ancient Egypt had been made through the study of its language. But Amelia was interested in the study of ancient Egypt through her objects, and her writing on excavation in Egypt helped to communicate this aspect of Egyptology to a wider audience. And in fact, she received a civil list pension for her services to literature and archaeology. Amelia was one of the first members of the Society for the Preservation of the Monuments of Ancient Egypt, set up in 1888. The society was established by a small group including Hilda Petrie, Wallace Budge of the BM, who we will hear about later, and Sir Frederick Burton, who was at that time director of the National Gallery, all of whom were worried about the level and pace of destruction of Egyptian sites. And the society aimed to support the Egyptian government to protect antiquities by installing doors, appointing guardians and inspectors, and building structures to restrict the encroachment of the River Nile and its annual floods. The other thing that Amelia and the Egyptian Excavation Fund did was objects that were collected during excavation out in Egypt. A selection of them were then returned to Britain, where they would go on display at UCL, which was where Hilda Petrie was based, and were then divided, and some of those objects would be passed to the British Museum to join its collection. And we have here examples of two objects which came into the British Museum collections via the work of Amelia Edwards and the Egypt Exploration Fund. And we see on the left a small mould-made faience scarab. If we look at the top here, we can see the head of the scarab beetle. We can just see a little bit of feathering indicating its legs and the division of the wing case on the back of the beetle. Underneath, we can see it is inscribed with a winged phoenix. It dates to about 600 BC and was found at a site known as the Scarab Factory in the Nile Delta. And it's a tiny object. When we look at it from the back, its overall thickness from bottom to top is 0.5 centimetre. The other object on the other side is a statuette of a king. Now this is much older, this is 3000 BC, and it's the ivory figure of a beardless king wearing a crown. And rather a nice little detail which I like is that the weight of the crown seems to be pushing down and pushing out the top of his rather large ears. Pharaohs are often shown on sculptures with very large ears to indicate that they are listening to their people. And in this case, his ears also appear to be weighed down by the office of Pharaoh. He's wrapped in a short robe, and although the bottom of him is missing, it's seen right at the bottom of the sculpture that he's striding forward with his left leg. And the robe is the type worn by Egyptian pharaohs during the Sed festival, which was a ceremony of royal rejuvenation to empower the pharaoh with the spiritual support of the gods and the secular power that he would need to continue ruling the kingdom. Now, both these objects came to the British Museum via the Egyptian Exploration Fund, which had been founded in 1882 by Amelia Edwards. And it continues today as the Egypt Exploration Society. Now, the BM acquired objects from the Exploration Fund via a subscription to the fund, on the understanding that the museum would receive objects from excavations in return. Thus, post-excavation finds accrued by the fund were then distributed to institutions and individuals who had subscribed. So the British Museum was not the only institution to receive objects. As we know, some of them went to UCL and are held in the Flinders Petrie Egyptian Museum at UCL. Now, Amelia died in April 1892, and she left her collection of Egyptian objects, books and photos to UCL. The rest of her library went to Somerville College, Oxford Women's College. She also bequeathed an endowment of £2,500 to set up a professorship of Egyptian archaeology at UCL, the first in Britain. And these classes would be open to male and female students. And this was one of the main reasons for Amelia choosing UCL, because it was the only academic institution at the time where women could obtain a university degree by examination. And indeed, on the first course, 7 of the 8 students were women. Now, one of the provisos of the endowment was that no person holding office at the British Museum was to be eligible to take on the professorship. And this effectively excluded the aforementioned Wallis Budge, who was keeper of Egyptian antiquities at the British Museum. And the proviso was probably the result of poor relations between Flinders Petrie and Wallis Budge, sparked by a letter about fines being transferred from UCL to the BM. Wallis Budge, in effect, was complaining that the objects that Flinders Petrie and UCL were offering had A, not arrived yet, and B, were not of a very good quality. Petrie wrote to Amelia before her death, saying that the letter had cut me out of the last refuge I hoped to work in for Egyptian doings. The false statements of that letter and the gross ignorance it showed of genuine and scientific archaeology bar me from having anything to do with that quarter again. And this meant that later on, when Petrie chose Stephen Garville to be his successor as a curator, Garville had to resign from his post at the British Museum and first be appointed as a reader in Egyptology at UCL for 2 years before he was able to take on the chair of professorship when Petrie retired. Now, Flinders Petrie worked in close association with his wife Hilda Petrie, and we're going to learn a little bit more about Hilda Petrie's work next. But I'd like to start with another object, which was the gift of the Egypt Exploration Fund. And what I'd like to use this object to do is just to have a little think about some of the work that was happening on an excavation out in Egypt at the time. So most of the excavations at the time were based around temples and tomb sites. And these sites would offer objects such as this limestone stele, which has a scene showing an elite member of the Egyptian ruling classes on the far right, a gentleman called Pusensa, who is offering to the god Osiris, first god, and behind him, the falcon-headed god Horus and the goddess Isis. Now, as well as the images carved into the stele, there is also hieroglyphic text. There are 10 columns of text at the top and 5 rows of text at the bottom. And one of the things that would happen during an excavation in Egypt is that archaeologists would copy inscriptions, not from objects which were then being brought back to the museum, but from similar blocks of hieroglyphic text, which were carved into the walls of temples and tombs. Then, as now, it was often quite difficult to photograph inside a tomb. What happens nowadays is that if you use a flash to get the light levels up, that flash will tend to bounce round between the different walls in the small space. So even today, copying and tracing is one of the principal means by which archaeologists collect details from inside a tomb. And this is the sort of work that Hilda Petrie was involved in, the copying of inscriptions when she worked on excavations out in Egypt. And here we have 2 photographs of Hilda. The first one to the left, working at Abydos, where she is checking inscriptions and drawings, copying those on the walls of the temple, which you see in front of you. And here to the left, Hilda descending into a tomb around 1897. Now, Hilda was born in 1871. She was the youngest of 5 daughters, and she grew up in Rustington, West Sussex. Her family also had a house in London where they spent each winter, and she later took classes at King's College for Women, including courses on geology and facsimile drawing courses. Whilst working at UCL, copying classical details from the UCL museum collections for the pre-Raphaelite painter, Henry Holland, she met Flinders Petrie at the summer 1896 exhibition showing discoveries from his recent season of digging near Thebes. After this, she began to illustrate scarabs in the UCL collection and developed an interest in ancient Egypt itself. And Petrie says in his diary that it was whilst walking down Gower Street to the British Museum that he decided he would one day ask Hilda to marry him. They were indeed married on the 27th of November, 1887, at 8 o'clock in the morning, before leaving for Victoria Station at 10 o'clock to travel to Egypt, having attended the registry office in their travelling clothes. In 1899, Petrie took over the concessions at Abydos, where Hilda drew small finds, copied hieroglyphs, compiled lists for the excavation catalogue of objects, and drew plans for the layout of each tomb excavated. One tomb sarcophagus that she worked on had an inscription of over 20,000 hieroglyphs, each of which had to be copied by hand. and Hilda was copying at a rate of 1,200 signs per day. Immediately following a season's dig, Hilda would go daily to UCL to prepare the plans and drawings for the excavation report, and also edit the text written by Flinders out in Egypt. Now, on excavation, Hilda was not expected to deal with domestic arrangements at the excavation camps, as there was a camp cook who saw to all the food. And as Hilda could not sew well, Flinders continued to darn his own socks. Despite having no licence, she drove the camp van to the local town of supplies. And as she spoke Arabic, she was responsible for recruiting the local workforce who dug on the excavations. In 1903, Hilda was dig director for a section of the Abydos site, in full control of the Egyptian diggers and their associated payroll, where she was working on an underground tomb with Margaret Murray, a UCL Egyptology graduate, who had a knowledge of hieroglyphs and funerary texts, so was involved in recording the inscriptions in the tomb, and also an artist from the Slade School of Art, Miss F. Hanson, who joined them to draw sculpted figures in the tomb. Now, the tomb itself suffered from sliding sand and seeping water, and after 2 further excavations, it now lies sanded up and partly underwater, meaning that the work by Hilda and her team constitute some of the information that currently exists about a tomb no longer accessible to modern archaeologists. Following Flinders' retirement from UCL, he and Hilda went to live in Jerusalem, where they continued their archaeology work. After Flinders' death in 1941, Hilda remained in Jerusalem, typing up manuscripts and editing the volumes of his work, which were yet to be published. She came back to England in the spring of 1947 and died in 1957 at University College Hospital following a period of ill health. Now, we'd mentioned that working with Hilda on the tomb in 1903 was a graduate of UCL, Margaret Murray. And we're going to have a little look at the work of Margaret Murray in the field of Egyptology next. Now, here we see 2 photos of Margaret Murray. The first one shows Margaret Murray here in the centre, wearing the white apron, with her team working on the unwrapping of an Egyptian mummy held as part of the collection of the Manchester University. And this unwrapping took place in the chemistry lecture theatre at the university on the 6th of May, 1908, before an invited audience of 500 people from the Manchester Egyptian Association. And in the days before X-ray and CAT scan machines, unwrapping a mummy was one of the main ways of actually discovering further information about the person contained in the wrappings, determining information such as sex, age at death, health in life, and possible cause of death. As we know nowadays, unwrapping a mummy is something which can only be done once, and the British Museum no longer unwraps its mummies. We send them to UCL Hospital, often in the middle of the night when the CAT scan machines are not being used, and we can CAT scan our mummies to collect information from them. But Margaret Murray was at the forefront of the scientific unwrapping of mummies to determine information to add to the field of growing knowledge at the time about ancient Egyptian burial practices, which was one of her specialities. And the other photograph we see is a signed photograph of Margaret taken in 1933, not long before her official retirement from UCL. Now, Margaret had been born in Calcutta, India, in July 1863. And she spent her childhood in India, England and Bonn before her family finally settled in London. In India, she had begun a career in nursing, and in England, she worked as a voluntary district visitor attached to her uncle's church in Rugby. She arrived at UCL in January 1894 to study Egyptology under Flinders Petrie. Her first publication was produced a year later, the first of over 80 books and articles. And then in 1898, she was appointed to a junior lectureship in Egyptology, making her the first woman in Britain to earn a living from teaching the subject. And her annual salary of £20 was paid by Flinders Petrie out of his annual salary of £100. He was at that time working as a part-time professor at UCL. She augmented her salary by lecturing in Oxford and London, and also cataloguing Egyptian collections in the National Museum of Ireland, the Royal Scottish Museum, the Ashmolean Museum, and Manchester University Museum, hence the connection we see here in the photo with her unwrapping one of their mummies. She later became a lecturer at UCL and worked there until her retirement in 1935. In her autobiography, Margaret acknowledges the role of Amelia Edwards in building up the teaching resources at UCL, although the two women never met. Amelia dying in 1892 and Margaret not beginning to study Egyptology until 2 years later in 1894. She also worked with Petrie out on his digs at Abydos, and it was here that she worked alongside Hilda Petrie. She also worked at Saqqara, where she was involved in copying inscriptions from the tombs. And here she worked alongside the artist Frida Hansard, who we met earlier as Miss Hansard, working with Hilda Petrie, and the archaeologist Jessie Munsale. During World War II, during World War I, Margaret briefly resumed her nursing work in St Malo, but poor health forced her to stop in 1915. 1921, her academic work at UCL prevented her from going out to dig in Egypt during her summer break, because the summer in Britain was the time when Egypt was at its hottest, and also when many sites were flooded by the annual River Nile flood. So she began work on Egyptian sites. And here we see some of the objects in the British Museum collection, which she gave to the museum from her excavations in Malta, which she conducted 1921 to 1925, with 3 volumes of reports published on the island's megalithic structures. And what we see here is prehistoric objects recovered from Malta. To the left, we have 2 spindle whorls, and a spindle whorl is a small disc or spherical object which is fitted onto a spindle to increase and maintain the speed of the spin. And it's the weight of the spindle whorl which gives the spindle the momentum as fibres are twisted or spun into yarn. Now, whorls are recovered across many sites globally and can be made from many materials. These ones are stone, but they can also be made from amber, antler, bone, ceramic, glass, metal, and even wood, as long as it's a hardwood such as oak. The other items we can see are a collection of 27 pottery wool sherds and 10 rim sherds from a variety of pots excavated in Malta. And what's interesting about this collection is that you can probably see that apart from a couple where the archaeologists have managed to reunite two fragments, most of the items do not fit together to make one single pot. And because archaeologists find potsherds on every excavation site in the world, and because they are often found in this fragmentary state, you will find that when they're catalogued, rather than being counted, a number that can get into the tens of thousands on some sites, pottery will be weighed. So the museum record for this set of pottery is that the rims, which are the items you can spot that have a clear top, because they come from the top part, the rim of the pot, they have a weight of 300 grams. So altogether, the weight is 300 grams. And then the 27 wall shards, which are the pieces that come from the main body of the pot, they have a total weight of 850 grams. So very often when you're looking at information about pottery, and in particular potsherds, you will see that rather than a number, a weight is given. Now, after retirement from UCL in 1935, Margaret continued to excavate, including work in Palestine alongside the Petries, Flinders and Hilda. During World War II, she lived in Cambridge, and after the war, she returned to London, where she lived in Endersley Street, very close to the UCL. And on most days, she visited the British Museum Library, and twice a week, she taught adult education classes on ancient Egyptian history at the City Literary Institute. She later moved to North Finchley, but died in hospital in Welling in 1962. She celebrated, sorry, I beg your pardon, she moved to Welling in 1962 because she celebrated her 100th birthday in July 1963. The same year, she published her autobiography entitled My First 100 Years, before passing away on the 13th of November, 1963. We're now going to take a short 10-minute break, after which we are going to turn our attention to a group of women involved in archaeology, focusing on the 1939 excavation of the ship burial at Sutton Hoo, and have a look at Edith Petrie, the owner of the site, and women who were involved in the excavation in 39 and also in later exploration of the materials when they were at the British Museum. Thank you very much. See you in 10 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. So we will move on from this fine image of pottery shards, which you've had 10 minutes to enjoy, and we are going to move on to Sutton Hoo, and we are going to begin our discussions of Sutton Hoo with Edith Petrie. And throughout this half of the talk, I will be making reference at times to the film The Dig, produced in 2001, and which was extremely popular amongst viewers at the time when it came out, and is available for watching, I believe, through Netflix. And we are starting with Edith Petrie, and a photograph of her on the left at Tranmere House on the Sutton Hoo estate. We can actually just see Tranmere House here in this aerial photograph. And this was photographed in the 1930s when Edith Petrie was living at Sutton Hoo. Also, we can see a picture of Edith during the ship excavation in 1939, where she is bending over whilst the archaeologist Charles Phillips explains to a visitor, Princess Marie Louise, about objects which have been recovered from the ship burial. And then right at the bottom, we have an aerial photograph of modern Sutton Hoo, which shows many of the elements we'll be referring to in the talk. So first of all, the main house where Mrs. Petrie and her family lived, the Sutton Hoo burial site, which you can see is surrounded by the modern access paths put in by the National Trust, and Mound 1 on the burial site is located just here. If I move my red marker away, you can just see a very, very faint beige mark, which is the post on top of Mound 1. There are other burial mounds in the burial site, and then below the burial site, the River Deben and the town of Woodbridge. Now, Edith May Dempster was born on the 1st of August 1883, and during World War I she served as a quartermaster at the Red Cross's Auxiliary Hospital at Winsford, Cheshire. She also helped to house Belgian refugees, and by 1917 she was working with the French Red Cross in France. After the war in 1925, on the death of her father, Edith and her sister inherited an estate valued at more than £500,000. And I've done a little calculation, and nowadays that means that Edith would have inherited half of an estate valued at £21 million. So she got £10.5 million equivalent in 1925. The next year, in 1926, she married Frank Petrie from Ipswich and brought the 526-acre Sutton Hoo estate. In 1930, Edith had a son, Robert, and her husband died in 1934. Now, Sutton Hoo itself gets its name from the nearby Suffolk village of Sutton, while Hoo means a hill or raised land overlooking water, in this case, the River Deben. And in 1937, Edith Petrie decided to have the 18 burial mounds on her property excavated. She contacted a local museum who recommended Basil Brown, and in 1939, Brown began work on the largest mound. The excavation was subsequently taken over by a team of academic archaeologists, and in September 1939, a treasure trove inquest declared that the objects unearthed from the ship were the property of the landowner, Edith Petrie. She subsequently donated the trove to the British Museum. In recognition of this, Prime Minister Winston Churchill offered her a CBE, but she declined. Edith Petrie died in 1942, and the Sutton Hoo estate, after being used by the War Office until 1946, was sold. In 1998, the house and the burial site were bequeathed by the then owners, the Tranmere family, to the National Trust, who now manage the site. So Edith Petrie, owner of the land, the instigator of the excavations on her land, which she paid for initially from her own pocket before it was taken over by other institutions, including archaeologists from the British Museum. And subsequent to the excavation, the finds being declared treasure trove belonging to the landowner, she then very generously donated all of the objects to the nation to be held by the British Museum. Now, throughout the excavation, photographs were taken of the process and of particular objects being lifted from the ship burial. Now, in the film, the photographs are all taken by one character, a fictional male character who is denoted as a member of Edith Petrie's family. In actuality, photographs of the site were taken by a number of photographers, including professional photographers from the Science Museum, and in particular the objects which we as the public are often used to see being illustrated on articles about Sutton Hoo, were taken by two ladies, Barbara Wagstaff and Mercy Lack. And we can see Barbara with her camera slung over her shoulder here in the left-hand image, talking to some of the excavators at the dig. And then on the right-hand side, in a photograph taken by the photographer from the Science Museum, again, we see Barbara on one side of the ship burial excavation, and on the other side, again holding her camera, we see Mercy Lack. Now, Mercy Lack was born in South London in November 1894, and she worked as a teacher. She was also a keen amateur photographer, capturing life on the nighttime streets of 1930s London on glass lantern slides, which are now held by the Museum of London. By the academic year, 35 to 36, she was teaching at Putney High School, where one of her teaching colleagues was Barbara Wagstaff. Mercy and Barbara both joined the Royal Photography Society in 1944 and became associates the same year. And going back to 1936, there had been a call in that year for amateur photographers to help document archaeological sites, with information published in the journal Antiquity, as well as photographers' magazines. Mercy and Barbara responded, and their photographs were noted to be of a better quality than many of the others. Now, in 1939, Mercy and Barbara were on their holidays during the summer break in Suffolk when the Sutton Hoo ship burial was discovered. They arrived at the site after the objects had been lifted, and therefore their photographs record the excavation of the ship itself between the 9th and the 24th of August. Their arrival was most fortuitous, and there is speculation that they had contacts at the British Museum who informed them of the discovery. Mercy and Barbara took most of their photographs using black and white film, but they also had 2 rolls of German 35mm Agfa colour slide film. And so Sutton Hoo was one of the first excavations in Britain captured in colour. And here we see on the left-hand side a photograph taken by Mercy Lack of the excavation of the ship's hull, a slightly unflattering photograph of Barbara as she leans over to look in detail at the excavations. And you can see here where the imprint of the wooden ship, the wood having rotted away over time, has left an imprint of its shape, the hull, the planks, and then the individual rivets, which can actually be seen more clearly in the other photograph, in the sandy soil. And this photograph on the right, taken by either Mercy or Barbara, again a coloured photograph showing the sandy soil, little clue as to the acidity of the soil in the bracken growing near the excavation, and 2 of the archaeologists working on the bow of the ship. Mercy took 297 black and white photographs. Barbara took 150. They also took 36 coloured photos each. And in addition, Mercy had a cine camera and took a short 16mm film of Basil Brown excavating the middle section of the ship. And together, they provided much of the visual material, both still and moving images, for a BBC documentary, The £1 Million Grave, which was broadcast in August 1965. Mercy was given a collection of ship's rivets by Charles Phillips, one of the archaeologists, on the last day of the 1939 excavation, and these she bequeathed to the British Museum. In 2010, a collection of about 400 prints of their Sutton Hoo photographs were found to have been donated to the National Trust a few years before by Mercy's great-nephew. Until then, there had been only the 29 official British Museum photographs of the excavation, and the records of measurement taken by the Science Museum, which had been lost during World War II. So the photographs allowed for a more detailed reconstruction of the dig than had previously been possible, particularly since many of them were annotated. And these photographs have been digitised by the National Trust and were due to go online this year, 2021. Now, another key figure in the film The Dig was one of the archaeologists, Peggy Pigott, who we see here being played by Lee James, alongside the actor who played her husband, Stuart Pigott. Now, it was a very inaccurate portrayal of archaeologist Peggy Pigott. She was born Cecily Margaret Preston in August 1912, and she's also known throughout her career as Peggy Pigott, which is the name I will be using today, and also Margaret Guido. She was an archaeologist, prehistorian and find specialist, and her career in British archaeology spans 60 years. And she's recognised for her field work methods, her seminal research on prehistoric settlements, as well as her contribution of more than 50 articles and books to the discipline of archaeology. And in the film, she's shown as a novice archaeologist, and in one particular scene, she actually goes into the ship hull and treads on part of the dig, which she would not have done, which I have to say I gasped in shock at, and which I hope you will too realise was very, very unrealistic when I tell you a little bit more about the real Peggy Pigott. And we have photographs of Peggy Pigott during the 1939 dig at Sutton Hoo. Here we see her working on some of the objects lifted from the central part of the ship burial. You can see here the gold buckle and part of the purse lid, which can still be seen in the soil waiting to be lifted to the right. We also see her in this photograph observing work at Sutton Hoo, and you can see how the archaeologists over delicate parts of the hull have constructed a wooden walking frame, which means that tools can be lifted above the dig surface so as to not impact on the objects and the excavation of the hull. And you can see also a few objects waiting to be lifted from the central part of the ship. And then our final photo on this screen shows Peggy excavating one of the hanging bowls, again from the central section of the dig. Now, Peggy's early interest in Roman coins had prompted her to join the excavation of Roman Verularium, that's modern St Albans, in 1933, where she excavated alongside Mortimer and Tessa Wheeler. She gained her first degree, then a diploma for women, from Cambridge University in 1934, and the next year she worked on pottery finds from the prehistoric site of Whitehawk Camp near Brighton. From 35 to 36, Peggy studied at the Institute of Archaeology, London, gaining a postgraduate diploma in Western European prehistory. She began her archaeological career working on the Iron Age, writing up the rescue excavation of an early Iron Age site in Berkshire and publishing the pottery from Iron Age Thurle in 1938. 38 to 39, she was working on a research excavation at the Iron Age site of Little Woodbury in Wiltshire. And in 39, she published the early Iron Age site at Langton Maltravers in Dorset. However, Peggy's own excavations mostly focused on the earlier Bronze Age. The first excavation she directed in 1937 was a Bronze Age barrow and Urnfield cemetery in Hampshire, which she published the following year. It was in the summer of 1939 that she joined the excavation of the ship burial at Sutton Hoo. This is a photograph taken by Peggy herself during the excavation of the central ship burial, and it shows a set of objects which Peggy is just about to lift. So she has photographed them to give them a finds context in relationship not only to the soil surface on which they were laid, but also to give an indication of the relationship and the positioning of the different objects. We also see she has included a ruler to give us a sense of scale for each of the objects in the photograph. And the main object in the photograph, which we see here to the left and underneath as it now appears at the British Museum, is the gold belt buckle, which Peggy excavated. The upper surface being covered in zoomorphic interlacing, design being picked out in tiny punched circles and then inlaid with Nuella black sulfur, which when heated runs through lines incised on the surface of the gold and hardens to highlight the individual areas of design on the top of the belt buckle, which itself has three large bosses, these three spherical buttons, which link through to a back plate, because the belt buckle is also a small little storage container, and the hinge at the side here, which you can just see the edges of the hinge, mean that there's a black back plate which flaps open to enable you to store something inside your belt buckle, as well as the latch on your belt buckle being used to hold your belt in place. Peggy also excavated two objects which are not shown in the photograph. This is a pair of gold sword harnesses in the shape of truncated pyramids. They're decorative items which would have been added on to the leather straps used to hold a sword. The four side panels are set with gold and inlaid glass work with blue glass on the top and the edge, and then around the base a band of shorter and longer rectangular cells filled with red garnet inlay. Going back up to Peggy's photograph, you can see objects with a similar sort of garnet cloisonné inlay, another belt buckle, shoulder clasps, and then here, that purse lid, which we saw on the previous slide, excavated in more detail immediately prior to it being lifted from the ground. And underneath the purse, this being the top, this being the bottom where it opens, these are the hinges. So underneath there would have been a leather purse which would have held any valuables, and that has rotted away in the acidic soil. And during World War II, Peggy directed numerous rescue excavations for the Ancient Monuments Department of the Ministry of Works on sites commandeered during the war for defence purposes. And throughout the 1940s, she was producing an average of 2 publications annually. She continued to research British prehistory and produce specialist artefacts reports, in particular reports on late Bronze Age metalwork, and also at the same time began to develop an interest in glass beads. Peggy's excavation of Iron Age hill forts and roundhouses established models for the development of both types of structure. And she also developed relative settlement chronologies for these types of sites in the days before carbon-14 dating was available to date archaeological sites and organic remains found at these sites. By the early 1950s, Peggy was working on prehistoric everyday life, the start of modern settlement studies. And in the late 50s, she moved to Sicily, writing guidebooks and reviews of Italian archaeological works for the British journal Antiquity. Back in Britain, she picked up her research on glass beads in the 1970s, travelling around Britain to see excavated examples as well as examples held in museums, and also visiting Europe in her camper van in the 1980s. In 1978, she published her first volume on ancient British glass beads, covering the prehistoric and Roman periods. She dedicated this volume to Tessa Wheeler, who she had dug with back in the early 30s. After this, she began her Anglo-Saxon volume on glass beads, and this was published posthumously in 1999. And both volumes remain the primary reference works on the topic. 1977, she became involved with the Devizes Museum and again turned her attention to prehistoric field archaeology, working on excavations at the age of 70 and publishing reconsiderations of previously excavated sites in the 1980s. She died on the 8th of September, 1994. And the objects which Peggy excavated and photographed are now on display at the British Museum in room 41. This gallery in the museum was redesigned and opened in March 2014 and lays the objects out in a central gallery in an attempt to give a sense of the placement of the objects in relationship to each other within the ship burial itself. And these objects are currently looked after by Dr. Sue Brunning, who is the Anglo-Saxon and early medieval curator at the British Museum. And her work and her research on the objects are available in a series of YouTube films, which are on the British Museum YouTube site under Curator's Corner, and also a number of other films which give you information about where the Sutton Hoo objects went to during World War II, where they headed off down into the underground. And you will also find a film that includes a short extract of the cine film taken by Mercy Lack, showing Basil Brown working on the ship burial in 1939. So with Sue Brunning, we bring ourselves up to date with the story of some of the women working in archaeology, and in particular, some of the women working in archaeology with a connection to the British Museum. And if anyone has any questions, I would be delighted to discuss matters with you further. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. First question. Regarding the picture of Hilda Petrie going down the ladder into the tomb, was this not considered risque to be showing her legs and underwear in the photograph? Was she considered daring or unladylike at the time, and how was she perceived in London?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think we'll start broad by saying that ladies wearing trousers and revealing the shape of their legs was something that was only starting to become acceptable in Victorian Britain as we head towards the 1880s. So it is certainly true that the idea of women wearing trousers, as Hilda Petrie did on her excavations, is relatively new. I think Hilda herself is able to tap into a couple of existing traditions, which mean that within the context of excavation overseas, her clothing is considered extremely suitable. First of all, there's the tradition of Victorian women travellers and the idea that to remain modest while you are climbing up and down, climbing over, sitting on the ground, the wearing of trousers enables you to retain your modesty, and that sort of cancels out the idea that it shows the shape of the leg. In addition, you'll notice that Hilda wore a very large smock top, rather like the tunics that are sold in shops such as Sea Salt nowadays, sort of that went down over her hips, down towards her knees, and sort of gave her a large balloon shape at the top, so sort of masking, and also was very comfortable when she was moving around in the heat of Egypt. So she made sure that her clothes enabled her to move around and remain modest. I think if we're talking about underwear, it's actually more interesting to talk about her husband, because Flinders Petrie did not like to be interrupted when he was on excavation. And we do know that he was often to be seen sitting in his underwear when he was excavating in Egypt. And what he would do, he would sit in his long johns and his vest, which were sort of a pink colour. And he hoped that by sitting there in his underwear, in a rather unassuming pink colour, which from a distance would make him appear to be naked, he would deter people from coming over to have a chat with him when he was busy excavating or drawing some finds in Egypt. So I think Hilda, in comparison to her husband, was probably considered extremely suitably dressed. And Flinders may have been the one who was considered a bit more unusual in his excavation garb.
That is fascinating. Do you know what? I did not think we'd be talking about someone in their long johns. That is really, really interesting. Thank you.
Yes, it was his way of saying, don't come over, because look, I've got my underwear on, so you don't want to come over. And to be honest, I don't want you coming over.
Right, so although certainly daring and pioneering, the women discussed in the presentation today seem to be of a reasonable means. Would you say that finance, sex, or perhaps something else is the primary concern today, keeping people out of archaeology as a field of study?
I think that is an excellent comment. And I completely agree. A lot of the women archaeologists working during the 1800s, they are able to move into that field of study because they have the money to support them travelling. I mean, certainly with Amelia Edwards, she had the ability to go on holiday. She went on holiday with her mother. They used to travel to Europe during the summer. That then enabled her as an educated person to write travelogues, and therefore sort of the money grew. But that came from the fact that she was an educated woman who could self-finance her work and came from a middle-class wealthy family. I completely agree. The other thing is that very often in the 1800s, women are able to sort of slipstream into that discipline by working in partnership with a man. And that's why often their work is sort of obscured by the fact that the male head of an excavation team is the person who does the publishing, is the person who will get the academic post. But women are feeding into that underneath, but that work is not seen. Again, we're looking at people with means. I mean, you could not say that Hilda Petrie, whose family had a home in Rustington and one in London, were not wealthy. This certainly gives her a stepping stone to be able to attend courses, the drawing courses, and then to be able to volunteer at the museum at UCL drawing their collections, which is how she then meets Flinders Petrie. And that is a problem nowadays. One of the things that's most often said is if people say, oh, I'd like a job in a museum, often the first thing they hear back is, oh, it's a good idea to get a bit of experience by volunteering. But you've got to have the money to support yourself to volunteer, because volunteering doesn't pay. I think that also the idea of archaeology as a career is not always something that is necessarily seen as being near the top of the career ladder. So as education has opened up, what we sometimes hear from parents, and I can give you a direct quote from a project that we were doing with some local school children, and one of the children said, oh, she said, I'd love to be an archaeologist when I grow up, having just finished the project. Tick. her mother said, oh no, you're not, you're going to be a doctor. So archaeology isn't necessarily seen as a career that is going to make you a lot of money, and it doesn't. So perhaps that problem still exists, is you have to sort of be in a position where you can afford not to be on a high salary, or are prepared to not be on a high salary. But that works for both men and women. And I think as education has opened up, so the discipline of archaeology has had to look at how inclusive it is. And certainly there are movements such as a group called Museum as Muck, who are looking at working class participation in this discipline of archaeology. And also another big question at the moment is diversity in archaeology, and diversity not only in field archaeology, but also in positions held at museums. So I think it's a very pertinent question, and one that archaeology is perhaps only really beginning to face up to.
Thank you. Before the digs at Sutton Hoo, was there known that there was a burial there? Also, you mentioned 18 mounds on the estate. What were in the other mounds, and were they all excavated?
Excellent question. Yes, the site at Sutton Hoo had never been hidden. The burial ground had always been there and visible. And it was assumed that it was an ancient ground. It was not necessarily known what period it was. It was often thought of as a Roman or a medieval ground. So it was only when the excavation in the late 30s started that it was determined that it was an Anglo-Saxon ground. There had been earlier excavations. There were excavations in Victorian times, and one of the mounds was excavated, and in it they found the skeleton of a horse, which had obviously been buried as part of the burial with the person who was buried. And also they found a small ship, and the rivets for this ship had survived. And we know that they were collected all up, and they were determined to be a bushel. So they were weighed, a bit like the potsherds, of iron rivets, and they were taken to the local blacksmith to be melted down and the iron reused. So we know there had been previous excavations, and the idea was that this was some form of burial ground. Mound 1 was not thought to have been excavated. When it was being excavated, it was found that there was a small shaft from the top of the mound going down a couple of feet, and at the bottom there was some Tudor vessels. And it's thought that in Tudor times, people having this idea that these mounds might have treasure buried in them, that they were rich graves, although they didn't know the period, had started to dig down from the top of the mound, not realizing that actually that was the worst place to start from, because you had the greatest amount of soil to dig through, dug down a couple of feet, found nothing, and therefore gave up, which was why when it came to the dig in 1939, they actually found an untouched burial. So some of them were dug in Tudor times unsuccessfully. Some of them were successfully dug and in effect destroyed in Victorian times. There were then digs in the 1930s. Mound 1 itself was redug in 1968 when they dug all the way down to the ground surface, so destroyed the 1939 excavation of the ship. They took a plaster cast of the ship impression and they dug all the way down. So Mound 1, as it is now, is a modern reconstruction. And then in the 1980s, there were further digs under Martin Carver, but his interest was not necessarily the mounds, but the area around the burial site, because they knew there were other graves around the burial site. And they found a number of medieval individual burials around the site. So the area was reused for burials post-Anglo-Saxon, but it was determined that these were not elite burials. They were probably criminals who had been hung on a local gallows and then buried out in an area of ground which was sort of considered pagan and not an official Christian burial ground, as a mark of the fact that they were criminals. So the site was dug all the way up to the 1980s. At the moment, it is in the ownership of the National Trust and is unlikely to be dug again, given that the current thought is that since total excavation is total destruction, you wait as long as you possibly can. You can use things like ground penetrating radar, but you wait as long as you can before you actually dig, unless it's a rescue dig, because we never know how techniques will improve and what technology will be available to us in, say, 50 years. That means we can recover more information than we do now. Sutton Hoo, the example is that in 39, they found no evidence of a body, so they thought it may be a cenotaph. When they did the work in the 60s, they tested the soil, and the scientific techniques at the time meant that they could test the chemicals in the soil in the center of the mound, and they found phosphates, which indicated that there probably had been a human body which had just rotted away in the wet, acidic soil. So a lovely example of how, as techniques get better, so you can recover more information during the process of excavation.
Thank you. That's excellent. And I think that's all the questions for today. So we'll say thank you very much, Katharine. That was fantastic. And hopefully we'll see you all next week.
Thank you. Have a lovely half term. See you the week after, when we will be looking at objects from London, I believe. I've just
got one thing. Beth's raised her hand. I think she might want. I'm just going to allow her to talk, and then
yes, of course.
Hi, Beth. I think you should be able to talk now. Do you want to put your question to Katharine?
I'm so sorry, I didn't have a question. I was trying to put a thank you in.
Oh, okay. That's fine,
you are most welcome.
So I can say thank you instead. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Thank you.
Well, what I would always say on the back of any talk is take some of those names that I mentioned, have a little Google, because with the wonders of the internet, there are now so many texts, like Amelia Edwards' book is probably up on Google Books, the digitized photos from Sutton Hoo. So I hope it's inspiration for further exploration.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. And we'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.